Your source for everything paranormal. ParaX.
Throughout the ages, history has been altered by word of mouth and the misrepresentation of those who might not have been present when some of the world's most significant events took place. Channelers Barry and Connie Strohm bring through the spirits of those who actually witnessed or took part in these historical events and lets them tell their stories in their own words. Welcome to Channeling History. And now, here are your hosts, Barry and Connie Strohm.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us on this 4th of July weekend. As you may know, we're the only show where we speak to the guests that have passed to the other side, and we are brought to you every week on Sundays by the ParaX Radio Network. I'm Barry Strohm, your host, and I will be doing the channeling tonight.
And I'm Connie Strohm, your co-host, and I would like to thank you for tuning in to our show this evening. Tonight, we've got the perfect guest to celebrate the 4th of July. We're going to be interviewing the spirit of Ben Franklin. We think that you will be amazed by his many accomplishments. He was truly a genius whose contributions played a huge role in establishing our country. We've prepared questions for our guest, as usual, but if you have any questions for us in the chat room, we are more than willing to take them on.
Well, since it's the anniversary of the birth of our country, it's a great time to think of the sacrifices that our founding fathers endured. I know many people are not familiar with the history of just what took place at that time, but the Revolutionary War with Great Britain lasted for 8 years. Our Continental Army was always underfunded. They were underfed, underclothed, and never had enough ammunition, and served under the harshest of conditions. The war took 8 years, and in that time, George Washington, who was in command of the army, only got to spend around 2 weeks in his home in Mount Vernon. We are probably all familiar with the term of Valley Forge. The winter of 1778, Washington took about 12,000 soldiers into winter camp there, which is very close to Philadelphia. The British had captured Philadelphia, so Washington wanted to stay relatively close to them so he could find out what was going on. Well, while he was in Valley Forge, Washington complained to Congress that almost 3,000 of the 12,000 men were unfit for duty because they had bare feet or were otherwise naked. Our country was built on a foundation of unimaginable sacrifice. Keep in mind that if the war was lost, all of those individuals who signed the Decleration of Independence would have been hung for treason. During the 8 years of the war, between 200 and 250,000 soldiers served the American cause. A fact that probably very few people know is that there were around 9,000 African Americans that fought in the Revolutionary War with the Continental Army as well. So there's much to celebrate for all of us on this 4th of July. Now, we always take time to give a small disclaimer at this point, because I'm simply the messenger speaking the words of a spirit, and I have very little control over the message. So we always try to give this little disclaimer when we begin, that the opinions and statements voiced on our show are the channeled words of the spirits and do not necessarily reflect our opinion, those of the ParaX Network, or our sponsors.
Last week, we interviewed the soul of the Reverend Billy Graham. If you missed that show, it's available on our YouTube channel. In fact, all of our shows are available for download on Podomatic, iTunes, and Spotify. When Barry channels tonight, he will be speaking the words of Ben Franklin. When he channels, he remembers very little of what he says. He will make an occasional mistake, as channeling is not an exact science. We do our best to bring you the messages of our guests as accurately as possible.
If you've listened to our show, you know that before we channel, we always say a prayer of protection. There's no doubt that there's evil out there, and we want to make sure that we're protected when we open a channel to the other side. So Connie will now say the prayer, and then we will begin to channel with the spirit of Ben Franklin.
God, please grant us your wisdom and protection. Grant us the knowledge that we can handle and keep us safe from all things that will harm us. Keep the messages positive and pure love. Keep us safe from our egos. We ask these things in the light of the seen, the unseen, and the honesty of God.
Okay, this is going to be an evening that I've been looking forward to. So, Connie, let's get started with the questions.
Okay, Ben, welcome to our show and thank you for coming. Would you like to begin with a message?
Yes, I would. If you know anything about me, you probably know that I never give up the opportunity to talk when I have the opportunity. So anyway, I would like to thank you for letting me come through on this glorious day. As you know, I was present for much of what took place during the Revolutionary War. I was part of making up the Declaration of Independence. That is the document that we celebrate today. In those days, we were very much at risk to speak against the British. The British was the strongest nation in the world. They had an incredible navy, they had a well-disciplined army, and they were very formidable opponents. We were relatively unprepared. Our men that wanted to take on the British were basically farmers, had little military training, and our Congress, or government that we formed, had no experience in how to find the food, the ammo, or all of the other necessities that a large army needs. So in the beginning, we were definitely feeling our way along. It was a very, very difficult time, and the reality is that we were very lucky that we did not get blown out of the water during the first couple years of the war. It was a very difficult time for America. There were many individuals in the colonies that remained true to the British tradition and supported them. You never really knew who your friends were or who your enemies were. So it was a very different type of war. We actually had family members on both sides. Sadly, my son was a British governor of New Jersey, and he continued to favor the British throughout the war, while I was on the side of the colonials doing my best to assure that they would win the war. So I am a perfect example of how families were split. So I am anxious to answer some of your questions, hopefully all of your questions. So, Connie, let's have it.
Okay, before I get into our questions, we have one in the chat room. Evidently, there were some human bones found in your basement, and that person would like to know, did you really allow medical experiments in your basement?
I did not conduct the experiments. They were done by another doctor who was very interested in the anatomy. He would come up with cadaver bodies. They were generally people that no one had claimed and that would have been buried in mass graves. So I did not have any part in that, but I was aware of what was taking place.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, you were born in 1706. What was America like in the early 1700s?
In the early 1700s, America was firmly a British colony. At that time, the British treated us more like family members. While we did have problems with people like the Penn family who owned Pennsylvania, it was not a terrible time. The British brought us many goods. They brought us educational materials. We could go over to Britain and go to their schools. So it was really not a difficult time. America in that day was very rural. The cities at that time had not had great populations, and the cities that were on waterways were probably the most important because all goods in those days would come in by water, mostly British trade items. There were very few organized educational institutions or schools. Many of the people lived agrarian lives. They were farmers. And the frontier was actually not very far inland. The Appalachian Mountains were considered wilderness area at that time. The Indians represented a challenge in areas to us. We tried to be friendly with them because in those days they could have joined together and done great damage to the colonies. So in the 1700s, America was truly a colony of Great Britain.
Okay, your father was a soap maker. Besides making soap, he also fathered 17 children. Tell us about your family life growing up.
It was very difficult. Needless to say, our house was very crowded. It was very noisy. There were children everywhere. And I only had a couple years of formal education. So I wanted to leave the family as early as possible. And my father wanted me to join the clergy and sent me to school for several years, but he did not have enough money to finish that. I was a voracious reader. I read anything I could find on my own, and I knew that I had to get out of the house if I was going to not lose my mind.
Okay, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Actually, when I was young, I wanted to be a sailor. I thought that it would be very interesting to be on the seas. In those days, there was much to explore. There were many countries to see, and the sea was the only way to travel. Today you have airplanes, but in those days we only had boats. And I wanted to see as much as I could.
Okay, so you only had 2 years of formal education. How was it possible for you to obtain the knowledge for all that you accomplished? You were amazing.
I read everything I could get my hands on. And I started to associate with other individuals that were interested in learning as well. I was an apprentice for my brother James in his print shop, and that gave me access to certain sources of information. I retained a lot of what I read, and I tried to use that knowledge to the best of my abilities.
Okay, could you explain the apprentice system to us?
In those days, when you became an apprentice, you were like an indentured servant. You were assigned to the person, and that individual would teach you a trade. It was a very difficult system, and it was not flexible at all. It was a system where, in my case, my brother James basically had control of my life. If he didn't like what I did, he could beat me or do really what he wanted. And I was indebted would be with him for a certain number of years. It was a very difficult situation. And while the apprentice system did teach you a trade, it did not allow you financial benefits during the time that you were learning that trade.
Were you ever a vegetarian?
Yes. In the beginning, I thought that being a vegetarian was a wise idea. I always thought that it was not right to take the lives of animals so that you could eat them. And I did go through a period where I was a vegetarian. Sadly, I did not stick with it, and I found that eating meat and many other rich items was much more enjoyable. And I paid for it. Throughout my later years, I suffered from gout and being overweight. Now, I would have been much better off if I had sticked to just eating vegetables.
Okay, could you tell us about silenced dogwood?
Silenced Dogwood was a pen name that I used while I was an apprentice in my brother James' print shop. He did not want me to be an active writer. I think that he wanted the attention and fame for himself. So I chose the name Silenced Dogwood as a pen name. And I wrote a series of letters that he printed in his newspaper. They were very popular. And the time came that I admitted to him that I truly was writing the Silenced Dogwood letters. He was infuriated that I would do that without telling him, and actually beat me for it.
Okay, so understandably, in 1723, you ran away from that apprenticeship. Why was that such a big deal?
When you were an apprentice for somebody, you had a status. When you were bound to that person for those years. If you ran away, you had no status and were actually a fugitive. So when I elected to leave him, I found that it was very difficult to find employment, and it was a very difficult time. I tried many different things and wound up doing well, but it was in those days, if you ran away from your apprenticeship, it was a big deal.
Okay, in 1728, you fathered a child named William. Would you like to tell us about his mother?
No. I have never told anyone who the father of William was, and I still don't intend to. She was a wonderful person, and I actually really loved her. But it was not a situation in which I could marry her or it was not a situation where I could marry her. What I did do is assume raising William, and when I got married, we took him in as one of our own children.
Okay, thank you. When you married Deborah Reed, it was by common law agreement. Why didn't you just marry her?
Well, I screwed up with Deborah. I actually really cared for her, but then I left her to go to England, and her mother decided that it would be better if she married another man. So she married, and her husband ran off and left her after spending her dowry money. He left her without getting a divorce, and nobody knew where he was. So technically Deborah was married, and there was no way that I could do a church service, because even in those days you could not be married to two people at once.
True.
The root of common law allowed us to live together. So I never was able to formally marry her, but she was my wife.
Okay. Would you describe her personality a little further for us?
She had, I think, what would best be described as a fiery personality. She had a bit of a temper, and she was actually a very strong-willed woman. She did a good job raising our children. There were times that I was gone for long periods, and she did a good job of raising our family. She was also quite industrious, and in the beginning, when we had started our own printing business, she would help, and she had a good mind for finances. So she was a very good woman.
Sounds like it. Okay, could you tell us about the dangers of smallpox in colonial America and inoculations?
Smallpox was a terrible thing in colonial America. We did not understand how it was spread in those days. We really did not have any ideas how to treat it. A high percentage of those that caught smallpox would perish from the disease. It could deform people, and it was just a terrible thing. When it would break out in areas, there were really no good ways to confine the epidemic. The idea of inoculation for smallpox began in the early 1700s. They would take a sample they would take a sample from a person with smallpox, and they would make a small incision in a healthy person and put that sample so that the individual would catch a small dose of the disease. There were those that did perish from the inoculation because it was very roughly done. But it was a way of protecting ourselves from that type of pandemic. I was personally in favor of it, and I wrote in favor of inoculation.
Did your son Francis die as a result of inoculation?
No. My son Francis was not inoculated. He died from the disease.
How many children did you father?
I fathered, I'm trying to think here. I fathered probably around 5 children that I know of. I had a rather rambunctious youth, and I did some things that I regretted.
Okay, let's get back to Francis. Why did you not inoculate him?
Deborah did not believe in inoculation for smallpox. We argued about it, and we decided that he would not be inoculated. When he caught the disease and died from it, I must admit that I was sorry that I did not override Deborah's objection and force him to be inoculated.
Okay, why did you spend so many years away from Deborah?
I was a British citizen. I felt very strongly that the British had the most cultured lifestyle of any of the countries at the time. I truly enjoyed living in Great Britain. I also enjoyed the fact that people respected me and that I was accepted at the highest social levels of British lifestyle and government. I also felt some resentment towards Deborah because of the death of Francis. I guess I blamed her for not allowing him to be inoculated, and it resulted in his death. I loved Francis very dearly, and when he passed, it was very difficult for me. One way, I guess, of escaping the grief that I felt was by living in Great Britain and spending time away.
Okay, did you ever own slaves?
Yes, I did own some slaves. In the beginning of the early 1700s, the ownership of slaves was pretty much accepted, especially in the southern colonies. I felt that they should be treated well, and I treated my slaves very, very well. They helped me with my household, and they had a good standard of living. As I grew older, I understood the horrible effects of slavery. And in my later years, I became a very well-established abolitionist. I freed all of my slaves, and I required my children to free their slaves before they could get their inheritance. So I was very wrong in the beginning of my life to have slaves, but I did honestly believe that all men were created equal.
Okay, why did you join the Freemasons?
In those days, Freemasons represented the elite among politicians and people of higher social status. Freemasons believed in God and did many good things. It was an opportunity for many of us to get together and to have discussions. Many of the founding fathers were Freemasons, and their ideals played a huge part in the principles that went into the founding of our country.
Okay. You hear a lot of negativities about the Freemasons. What role did they play in the founding of our country?
They instilled the concept of God, and they brought together many of the most influential people in the colonies at that time. The Masons were a very secret organization. So they got a lot of criticism, but they did much good for our country. Okay, let's take a little bit of a break here, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes, and then we will have more questions with Ben Franklin.
Don't go away. Channeling History will return right after these brief messages.
In order for the light to shine so brightly, the darkness must be present. Tune in every Monday at 10 o'clock for Dark Sun Rising on the Para-X Radio Network. From Haunted Road Media comes an exciting new novel by author Marla Brooks, Soul Connection, A Deadly Obsession. Two lost souls, ripped apart by murder in another century, find each other again in the present, only to discover that the murderer has followed them through time. Can their love save them, or will history repeat itself? Find out in this captivating new novel by Marla Brooks, Soul Connection, A Deadly Obsession. Available now on Amazon.com and at BarnesandNoble.com.
You've no doubt heard of Tango and Cash, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Perhaps it takes two to tango. Well, now, on the first and third Thursdays of each month, there's a show called Tango and Friends at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Para-X Radio Network with your host, Bruce Tango. And yes, there will be at least two to tango on each episode, sometimes even more. There's going to be lots of topics and lots of guests you'll all know and lots of surprises. Tango and Friends every first and third Thursday of the month at 8 p.m. right here on the Para-X Radio Network. Have you ever wondered what Jesus and his followers would say if you could receive their messages today? In his new book, Spirits Speak, Channeling Jesus and the Holy Spirits, channeler and author Barry Strohm answers those questions for you. Using his gift of spirit communication, he brings you messages from such Holy Spirits as Moses, John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary, Jesus, and even Mother Teresa and the Reverend Billy Graham. They discuss topics that are important for contemporary life in these troubled times. Spirits Speak, Channeling Jesus and the Holy Spirits is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other booksellers. Signed copies are available on the author's website, spiritspredict.com. After reading this book, you will never again say, "What would Jesus say or do?" Welcome back to Channeling History. Now, here are your hosts, Barry and Connie Strom.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Connie, let's go with more questions.
Okay, Ben, could you tell us about your belief in God?
I always had a very firm belief in God, and it was based on the classic teachings. I believed there was a heaven, and I believed there was a hell. But I never had any doubts that God truly existed.
Okay, that being the case, why didn't you attend church?
I actually visited many different churches, but I always had some questions in my mind. There were things in the Gospels that didn't add up for me, and because of my inquisitive mind, I never really thought that any one religion would truly live up to my expectations. It was just simply that I had my own belief structure, and no religion lived up or emulated that belief structure.
Okay, you made many inventions, such as the Franklin stove, that helped others. Why didn't you patent those inventions?
By the time I got truly involved with inventions, I had accumulated enough money that I felt very comfortable. I also thought that since my inventions helped others, it was not right to profit off of those inventions. So many of the inventions that I did, I just simply let individuals use so that it could help others.
It's very kind of you. Tell us about Poor Richard's Almanac.
That was a small book that we published. We did it every year, and it had many, many sayings in it. It was something that I could write about. It was a place where I could make comments on political structures, and it was immensely successful throughout the colonies.
Okay, what do you consider your best saying from there?
Well, to be quite blunt, I think I had a lot of good sayings. One of my favorites was "A stitch in time saves 9." Now, I know you're going to ask me what that means. In those days, a stitch was a method of birth control. And if you used that method of birth control, it would save you from 9 months of a pregnancy. So I thought that was some of the wisest advice that I could ever give.
I actually remember hearing that when I was younger. Okay, in 1749, you retired from business. After you retired, what occupied your time?
After I retired, I had considerable wealth, and I had a very inquisitive mind. So I tried to do different inventions. I tried to help people. I started an institution that was to become University of Pennsylvania. I started fire departments. I did many, many things to help others. I always felt that helping others was the most important thing a person could do.
Okay, Jesus would approve of that. What do you consider your greatest invention?
I believe that my contributions in electricity led others to advance and to learn much more about it.
Okay, could you tell us about your kite experiment?
I wanted to prove that there was static electricity and that lightning was truly electricity. So I flew a kite into a cloud, a storm cloud, and we actually collected static electricity from it.
Did you understand that that kite was struck by lightning? It would have probably killed you?
I thought there was a chance of it, but I tried to be careful. I stood on what I felt was insulation, and I kept myself dry so that I would not become a conductor. But now that I'm on the other side, I do realize how stupid it was.
Well, we all do things once in a while like that. What made you become interested in politics?
Politics was another way that I felt that I could help individuals. It was a difficult time politically, and I started to try to hold political offices. I became postmaster for the British, and when we formed the colonies, I became postmaster general, and I did many things in politics.
Okay, could you tell us about the Stamp Act and its effect upon the colonies?
Britain was in financial problems because of the expenses of the wars that they were always fighting. They decided that they would try to tax the colonies, and that basically any type of written document would require a stamp that the individual that wanted the document would have to pay, and that money would go to Great Britain. It was probably the first example of taxation without representation, and it put a burden on colonial America.
Okay, you became one of the richest individuals in the colonies. Tell us about some of the philanthropy that you did for the people.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I tried to establish educational institutions. I formed fire departments because fire was a huge danger in Philadelphia at the time. I formed libraries where individuals could come in and educate themselves in the documents of the day. I actually left grants, long-term grants, to the city of Boston and Philadelphia for the cities to use that money appropriately. I truly tried to help as many others as I could.
Yeah. Okay, you always considered yourself a loyal Englishman. What made you change?
The British royalty was having no respect for the colonies, and they were starting to put taxation upon them, and they were giving the colonies absolutely no way that they could participate in the laws and taxes that were being forced upon them. I tried to mediate between the colonies and Great Britain, but I was met with such negativity that I soon realized that we would have to split from them.
Okay, what was your opinion of the Boston Tea Party?
I thought it was terrible. At the time, I was still trying to mediate between British and the colonies, and I was actually opposed to what they did in Boston.
Okay, tell us about your love of swimming.
In my earlier days, I was quite athletic, and I loved to swim. I was very good at it, and I actually invented the concept of swim fins.
Okay. You were 70 at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Would you describe your health at the time of the signing?
While Thomas was working on the Declaration, I was having a bout with the gout, and I was having trouble getting around, and actually was not as much help as I had wanted to be. Thomas did a wonderful job, and I was proud to make a few changes for him and suggestions, but he carried the brunt of the authority for the Declaration of Independence.
Okay. You are the only founding father to have signed all 4 of the key documents to establish the United States: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris establishing peace with Great Britain, and the U.S. Constitution. Do you think we should call you the father of our country?
I must honestly say that I did quite a bit for our country. But George Washington suffered great inconveniences for the entire time of the war. He was out there taking the brunt of the criticism when we lost. He was a brilliant leader, and he also took over as the president for 2 terms. He did so much for the country that I do think he is the father of our country. Although I did do much, and the time that I spent in France was very critical to the war effort.
Would you consider that your greatest contribution to the founding of our country, your time in Paris?
Yes. They trusted me to go to France and to negotiate that France would enter the war on the side of the colonies. France was the only other country that had the ships and the men to represent a threat to Great Britain. If I had not been able to bring France into the war, it is problematic whether we would have been successful. Great Britain was an incredible power at the time, and it was only through the intervention of France that we were finally able to defeat them at Yorktown.
Okay, at the age of 81, you were elected as a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention. What role did you play in writing the Constitution?
I made suggestions. As at the age of 81, I was starting to slow down a bit, needless to say. I felt that one of the most important things was the concept of freedom of speech. If you lose the freedom of speech, you will lose everything. I did make suggestions. I signed the Constitution, but I was truly limited at that time.
Okay, as you watch from the other side, what are your thoughts on our current government?
So much has changed since my time. I am astonished at how large the central government has now grown. In our day, we tried to respect states' rights. The states had to agree before we could form a central government. Now what I'm watching is a central government that is interfering with states' rights. So everything is basically upside down. I do think that the problems of the bureaucracy of a huge government will be a huge hindrance to your advancement in the future.
Yeah. Do you believe any changes should be made to the Constitution?
There are areas that we never considered. For instance, all of the internet, all of the communication, and we never conceived of the fact that news agencies would become so huge and could have such an impact on the entire country. Keep in mind, our papers were only distributed by hand, and if a couple thousand people read the opinion, that was a lot. Today, your news agencies reach millions of people, and if they choose to distort what they present as news, that can have a huge influence upon the individuals. I do believe that there has to be limits to the powers of communication institutions that have become monopolies.
Okay, your face appears in many places, especially on our money. What do you think when you see how well you are remembered?
I am truly honored. I never thought that my name or face or influence would last for so many years. I tried to help many people in my life, and I think that I did succeed. I am very flattered that individuals still choose to honor me.
Okay, is there anything in your life as Ben Franklin that you regret?
We all have things that we regret in our lives, and I did many things that I look back on that I wish I had not done. I must admit that there were times I was not true to my wife when I was on my missions, and I wish that I had that to do over again. So all of us have clay feet, and it is best to just simply ask God for forgiveness for those things and move ahead and do the best that you can do in the future.
I'm totally on board with you. You did a lot for the city of Philadelphia with your philanthropy. What do you think of the city today?
I am saddened with what has happened to the city of Philadelphia. There are many individuals living in the city that feel that they have no future. They feel that they cannot advance, and they feel that they basically have no hope. I'm also watching a degeneration of the family unit in the inner cities, and that is a terrible thing. It can only be if family units remain strong and influence the younger people, that those people will be able to advance and have a thirst for education. Education is the key to advancing.
Yes. Your name is on many educational institutions, such as Franklin Marshall College, Franklin Institute, and others. What do you think of what these centers of learning have become?
In my day, we had free thought and free communication. Today, I am seeing that many of the institutions are becoming more of a political factor than I would hope that they would become. Institutions have got to be a place where people can freely exchange ideas. They cannot be institutions where people are punished for their ideas. Even though their ideas are wrong, who is to say that they do not have the freedom of speech to voice those opinions?
Right. We have a question from one of our listeners. It says, what are your thoughts on heaven, and do you see your son who died from smallpox now that you're there?
Yes. As soon as I came over, my son was there to greet me. Heaven is the most magnificent place. I can't truly describe it. It is not anything that an individual can truly comprehend. We can do things that you cannot imagine. I can communicate with all of the great thinkers of the world. I am friends with Plato. Imagine being able to ask Plato questions. I mean, it is something that is truly indescribable.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question from our chat room for you. It says, do we have too many agencies in our federal government?
The bureaucracy of your federal government has grown beyond comprehension. It is now more of a business than it is an institution that we founded to guide the people of the country. Your current government is trying to assume too much control over the individuals. We focused on equality of people. We focused on freedom of speech. We focused on freedom of religion. And we tried to create a document that would lead the people of the country for many, many years. And we succeeded.
Okay, we have another good question from one of our listeners. What would be the best way to help save America?
America is a very strong country. There are many, many individuals living in the country today of strong morals, of strong family values, and have great pride in their country. What needs to take place has to begin at the family level. If parents instill a strong feeling of a love of God, of following His teachings, and of having children help others and help to believe that the best is yet to come for our country. If the family structure leads its children, then your country will remain strong.
Okay, very good. Do you have a final message for us, Ben?
Yes. I want to thank you for allowing me to be here on this day that you celebrate the founding of your country. America is the greatest country in the world. Individuals have got to truly believe that. There are millions of individuals throughout the world that would love to come to the United States. But you must also realize that the country has limited resources and that your politicians must learn to not spend in deficits of the incredible scales that they're doing today. America is a one-of-a-kind country. When I returned over here, I found out that God had truly influenced all of us in writing the Constitution and all of the documents that founded the United States. Follow God's teachings. Show love, show charity, show faith, and all will be well for your country. So I thank you for allowing me this time to speak. If you would like to talk to me again, I would remain available because I never turn down the opportunity to speak. So good night, thank you, and God bless all of you.
Thank you, Ben. God bless you, and very happy to hear that you'll be happy to come back because this was a great interview tonight. Thank you so much.
Okay, next week we're going to have another very interesting show. We're going to interview the spirit of King Richard III. He was killed in 1485 and was the last king of the House of York when he was defeated by Henry Tudor. He was subject by a play written by Shakespeare in which there are many, many distortions. He wants the truth of his life to be known, and we're going to give him a chance to answer the questions next week. You can submit your questions or recommendations for future shows in advance through our email, channelinghistory@gmail.com. My new book, Channeling Jesus and the Holy Spirit, has chapters devoted to Mary, Jesus, and brings all their contemporary messages forward. You can buy the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever books are sold, and that is also available on Kindle. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. I know I enjoyed the information that we gained from Ben Franklin. I hope that all of you have a wonderful 4th of July. Thank you for joining us. We will be back next week.
And I, too, would like to thank you all for joining us. God bless you all. Have a wonderful week, and hopefully you'll be back again with us next week.
Thanks for listening to Channeling History. Tune in again next week for another electrifying episode, as we never know who will make an appearance or who will come through the portal. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2020. Our Story Begins by Kevin MacLeod, licensed through Incompetech.com.